Hey guys, welcome to eCommerce 360. We have Alex today. Alex is a marketing manager of Loop Returns, to say the least. Of course, he's wearing many different hats. But let's talk about Loop. Loop Returns is an e-commerce company that automates returns and exchanges on Shopify. Alex, I know I barely scratched the surface in your introduction. Do you want to talk a bit about yourself, about your podcast, about your own e-commerce, your own company that you are running?
Sure. I always say that the hardest question in any interview is the tell me more about yourself. I always feel like that's the hardest one for me to answer. But yeah, like you said, marketing manager at Loop Returns. I also have my own retention consulting agency called Spark Retention. So helping e-com brands retain more customers and boost the repeat customer rate. I'm also the co-host of a podcast called The Exchange. And we talk all about customer retention, brand building, and customer experience. So podcast is all about the tactics that you can use on the other side of acquisition. So we don't talk about advertising at all. We talk about everything else you can do in e-commerce.
Okay, that's great. Also, can we get started on a bit about Loop Returns and then we will move on to Spark? So the reason why we want to talk about Loop Returns is returns account for 20 to 30% of e-commerce sales, and it's the biggest nightmare for any e-commerce business. So how does Loop Return, alleviate this pain point a bit for e-commerce companies?
Yeah. So at Loop, we like to say like a lot of people do view it as a nightmare right now, but we actually like to view it as more of an opportunity than a nightmare. So, like you said, somewhere between 20 and 30% of purchases are going to be returned, and that's going to vary based on industry. So, 20 is probably your like apparel brand. Once you get up into that 30%, it's going to be footwear. Now, what we say at Loop is that you don't want customers to a lot of people are going to say, hey, if a customer keeps something, that's great. Like, I don't want them to be returning this. But that's because we often use return and refund synonymously. A lot of brands are saying if something's going to be returned, I'm giving the money back to the credit card and I'm losing out on that sale. But on Shopify, 52% of returns that happen are actually because someone has the wrong size. So, more often than not, when someone comes to return something, they're actually looking for an exchange, not a refund. So, if you look at returns as it could be a refund, it could be store credit, it could be an exchange, then you can start to say, okay, when these come back as a return, if I can offer up an exchange, and that's what Loop specializes in, is I can keep that customer. I can convince them to come back and make another purchase, or if they're finding something that they really love, that word of mouth, that referral rate is going to go up as well.
That's great. So, what you're saying is Loop Return is focusing on making returns seamless because they want to have an increased personalization or help customers simplify the return process for engaging them more with the product rather than just getting a refund. Right? That's great. So you probably have analyzed a lot of data with respect to returns, right? So what are some of the interesting findings that you have unearthed so far? Like, is there a trend or a pattern? Like we were talking before about the pandemic, whether the returns have gone up or gone down, or is there any particular pattern that you discern while analyzing these data?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We haven't so far seen a huge change in return activity through the pandemic. So obviously volume's up, but volume's up everywhere in e-commerce. Sales are up. Pretty much everything in e-commerce is up right now. But returns as a percentage, like we were talking about before, hasn't really changed much through the pandemic. Some of the more interesting things that we've been seeing lately is talk about like your return window. So a lot of
Hmm.
people, if we go look at like 10 sites right now, I bet 9 of them have a 30-day return window. It's kind of just become this standard.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that we've noticed is that around 80% of returns that happen in the first 14 days.
Okay.
So the vast majority of people returning something, they're going to do it pretty quickly. And that makes sense,
Hmm.
right? Like I got something, it doesn't fit. I want to get into the right product. So it's interesting because when you look at everyone with a 30-day return window, majority of it's happening in 14 days. So people might say, hey, I want to switch my return window to 14 days since 80% is happening then. I'd actually argue this shows us that we can start to be making more generous return windows. If the vast majority of the volume is going to happen right at the beginning anyway, you're not
Yeah,
actually losing out on much by extending that out and going from like a 30-day window to a 90-day window that you can then turn your return policy into a bit of a marketing asset for yourself.
that's very fascinating. So what you're saying is, why have a 30-day window when you can, get most of the returns? 90% of the returns are going to happen in 14 days. So that's a very interesting insight. So in continuation to that, is there a correlation between returns and repeat purchase rates? Do easy returns make a good strong case for more purchases? Is that what you see in the trend?
Yeah, so we're actually in the process of doing a big analysis of this at Loop right now, and I'll make sure that we can follow up with it as soon as we're done.
Okay.
But what we are seeing is that people who interact with a great returns policy, we are seeing a lift in LTV. The
Hmm.
exact amount, we're still trying to figure out what that is, but we are starting to see a relationship between a great returns experience and lifetime value. And is
Okay.
that increase in lifetime value coming from higher purchases after once they know that a return is easy? Are they more likely to buy more in the future? Or is it causing more repeat purchases? We have to dig into that a bit further, but the LTV is increasing.
I think that that's pretty much the question that I was going to ask you later. Like, what metrics are going to have an impact because of the efficient return process? I think mostly what you're saying is LTV is going to see an immediate impact. Are there any other metrics that you foresee having any impact due to efficient return process, or if brands can optimize their returns, where do they have to measure it? How do they go about measuring? Which metric they have to go about measuring for seeing an impact?
Yeah, so I think a lot of brands, when they think about returns, their go-to metric for measuring like how effective they are is return rate. So what is the percentage of all of my orders that are coming back? We talked a bit about that at the beginning of the episode. I think a lot of people also try to evaluate their returns policy based on like cost savings. So what am I paying per shipping label? How can I be more efficient there? But
Mm-hmm.
what we're actually seeing is the top brands are shifting away from treating returns as a logistics play, and they're starting to shift it into a customer experience and a marketing play. So when they do that, they start to look at a couple different things. So instead of looking at return rate, and if we say, hey, we want our return rate to be as low as possible, we're always going to be trying to do things that drive that down. And what's the easiest way to drive your return rate down? Hide it, bury it, put it in the footer, bury it in your FAQs. Like, don't let anyone find it. But if we're saying that seamless and easy returns and more importantly, exchanges experience is going to lead to higher lifetime value, then you need to look at your returns differently. Instead of looking at it as a return rate, we
Mm-hmm.
call it like the return composition. So start to evaluate what percentage of all of your returns are exchanges, because a return doesn't have to be bad. If we can get someone into a new product that they love, that's going to be good for us long term. So what I would recommend is that everyone listening, if you're evaluating your return policy and your returns process, is take that return rate you're probably looking at right now and break that down one step further. So you can see what percentage of all of your returns are coming in as refunds versus exchanges, and try to be doing things that are going to drive more exchanges and a higher exchange rate and a lower refund rate.
That's great. So that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about in my next question. It's about personalization, right? So when it comes to returns, brands do not consider personalization as something that can implement. Whereas when you think about returns in terms of exchanges, you can still personalize the hell out of those exchanges as well. So do you see brands extending personalization in their returns process as well, or what do you see?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like personalization in kind of like the textbook definition, you get a bit of that in the returns process, in the returns experience. I would say
Mhm.
where you're getting more personalization lately in ecom is with that exchange experience, right? So in the past, an exchange would be like, hey, you bought something, we'll give you store credit, go and buy something else. Where with a tool like Loop, you can actually, I don't know, take a pair of jeans and say, hey, I want to exchange these, and then shop the catalog for something else. So not necessarily like the personalization level of like all these crazy recommendations, but just
Mhm.
making it a more personal experience, right? Like if you think about a retail experience is. I don't go in, go up to the counter, get store credit, go back out, shop, come back, and like do all
Yeah.
that. I
Yeah.
do it all at once. And like
Mhm.
that's the experience that's the level of personalization that people are looking for, especially with everyone coming online that was traditionally just retail shoppers.
That's great. That's great. So let's take a slight detour. Let's talk about retention, which is your favorite topic. You have been a forerunner for customer retention in e-commerce space. And do you see businesses pivoting their strategies for a stronger retention, trend or strategy? Is that what they are looking at? Is that what you're focusing on? Or do you still see them clinging on to acquisition?
Um, More and more we're seeing brands turn to retention than we did in the past. So
Mhm.
I've been retention's been my main focus and something that I'm super passionate about for about 5 years now.
Yeah.
And 5 years ago, people looked at you like you had two heads when you started talking about this. Acquisition was so cheap, so inexpensive. The market hadn't really yet matured. So acquisition was cheap and easy. Fast forward to today, and you're seeing more brands pay attention to customer retention. But unfortunately, I still don't think it's the majority or even 50%. I'd say 75% of brands are still very acquisition heavy, and they might have like one person, or they might be devoting like 10 cents of every dollar they invest into marketing into the retention side versus the acquisition side. So it's uh it's getting better, but it's definitely not
Nowhere.
solved or mainstream yet.
No, okay, it's nowhere where we want it to be. So I've just I think before this interview I went over your retention masterclass, and you do make a very strong case for why brands should look at retention. Do you want to give us a brief look into why brands should, give this retention strategy or their retention strategy a very, very you know focus that they are not giving right now?
Yeah, I'll try to be as brief as possible,
Yeah.
but retention is really the in my opinion the last place to compete with your marketing. So as I
Mhm.
said in the answer to that last question, we're seeing acquisition costs rise. We're seeing the market get more competitive. I mean, I think Shopify, we're across like a million Shopify stores now, and that's just one e-commerce platform for all the brands that are vying for your customers' attention. So customers have a ton of choice, and they don't need to go and buy from you just because they saw an ad.
Exactly.
So the place where brands can invest is building that relationship with the customer. And I feel like a lot of people look at customer retention and go, oh, it's how do I get someone who made one purchase to make two purchases? Yes, that is an important step, but it's all about establishing a relationship with that person. They aren't always going to be able to buy from you, depending on what you sell. Someone's not going to be buying every day, but the idea of customer retention is to build this sense of community, to build this sense of belonging. Some people will call it loyalty. Some people will call it retention community. It doesn't matter, but being able to build up that base of people that are looking to you for everything, to be a subject matter expert, to be the person that they turn to when they have a problem or an opportunity. Like that's how you get, that's what leads to long-term success. Acquisition is like, if I turn the faucet off, my business dies. If you have a strong mix of acquisition and retention, even if I turn off that faucet of acquisition, my business is going to sustain and actually continue to grow with my existing customer base.
So building real relationships with customers. So that's a great retention strategy. So also, if you can talk to us about effective post-purchase communication, how does it actually fall into this retention strategy? How far can brands go with post-purchase communication and establish a great relationship with their customers? It will be great.
Yeah, so retention marketing, like there's a lot of facets of retention marketing, and
Mm-hmm.
post-purchase communication is what I call the low-hanging fruit of retention. So anyone listening, if you're getting into customer retention for the first time, that post-purchase communication is obviously like the biggest part of it.
Okay.
It's going to lead to the quickest results, because retention, I like to say, it's like rolling a snowball. It's exponential growth, right? It starts small and it gets bigger over time. But to get back to your question on how do you build those post-purchase communication, it's number one, like put yourself in the customer's mindset, not yours. So like I see way too many post-purchase flows where it's like, hey, you made a purchase. And then like within a day, it's like, do you want to make another purchase? They haven't even got that first purchase yet. And you're already encouraging them to make a second one. So think about the experience from their perspective. Make
Mhm.
sure that you're offering the post-purchase communication at the right time. So in terms of the first couple communications, it might just be like, hey, like your package left our depot, your package is on its way, your package arrived, and like making sure that people understand like when they're going to actually receive this. Because in ecom, it's not like going to the store and like I make a purchase and I hold it right away. There's a lot of silence and there's a big gap between when someone makes that first purchase and then they actually are able to hold and experience that thing. So you as a brand need to make sure that they're not just sitting there wondering, waiting. When they do get that product though, you need to make sure that you're telling them everything they need to know to be successful with it. So as like some things are pretty easy, like a candle. I get that candle, I light it, and I'm experiencing it. But say you sell something like supplements or I don't know, shampoo, there is an element of education that goes into this to making sure that once they get it in their hand, they actually use it and they achieve what they wanted to get out of that. I bought the shampoo because I want stronger, thicker hair. Well, if I only use a little teeny tiny amount of it and I only do that like every 3 days, I'm not going to get the results that I need from it. So it's an education piece and it's making sure that you know when someone's likely to make a second purchase. Because again, we don't want to just drop that on them the day after. But if you're able to take a look at what your average time between purchases is, or when do your best customers, your top 5% of customers end up making a second purchase, you can start to line up your email, your SMS marketing with when that's going to happen to increase the likelihood of that second sale.
Right, right, right. Relevancy and the timeliness of the post purchase communication so that it doesn't look too spammy. You don't want to spam their inboxes. At the same time, you want to be there when they need you. We've spoken so much about retention, and you have been advocating about customer retention strategies to almost all e-commerce brands that you consult. What do you think is the biggest obstacle when it comes to adopting a strong retention strategy? What is stopping them from adopting a strategy which seems logically quite simple, right? It's quite logical, but then they struggle to adopt it full-fledgedly. Why do you think is that?
Yeah, I think it's not a timing thing, but a how long it takes. So a lot of people, as an example, like when I start talking to brands about retention and retention consulting, um, it's harder because it's that exponential growth, right? Like you're not going to see anything meaningful in the first
Mm-hmm.
couple days, in the first couple of weeks. It takes a couple of months to build this up. If you're going to build a community, if you're going to build on retention, it doesn't happen overnight. So I think that's the hardest part for brands right now is acquisition is like if I put 100 more or if I put $1,000 more into my customer acquisition in Facebook or Instagram, like I see the results pretty instantly. So when you're a brand sitting there thinking about like, oh, I need to grow this year and where's that growth going to come from? It's very easy for me in my mind to be like, okay, I put $1,000 here and I get, I don't know, $2,000 out, or like for a lot of people, it might be like $1,300 out. Like the return isn't as good as it used to be, but that's the biggest obstacle right now. It's like I get instant gratification from customer acquisition, but it's delayed gratification on customer retention, and that stops a lot of people from giving it enough time. You see a lot of people jump in and start to work on it and then they give up after like 2 or 3 weeks. It requires constant effort and like continual improvement and it requires enough time to see results.
So, what is the typical timeline that you see brands start, gaining from their efforts in customer retention strategies? Is there a specific timeline that we are looking at? Maybe 2 years, 3 years, 5 years?
It, it really depends. Like if you're looking on a year timeline, so like 5 years out, like you're absolutely going to start seeing the results if you're doing it properly.
Mm-hmm.
um, I would argue that you can start to see results in a couple months. It really depends on what your time between purchases is. So earlier we were talking about post-purchase flows.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the lowest hanging fruit and the quickest turnaround retention play. But even that, if I sell, I don't know, weighted blankets, and someone makes one of those purchases like twice a year or once every 3 years, no matter how good my post-purchase flow is, I still need to wait the interval between those purchases to see results. So it's going to vary based on what you sell. But with something like post-purchase, you can start to see results maybe like 2x your average time between purchases. If you're going for more of like a content play or an organic social play, like I would argue that takes like at least 6 months to see anything meaningful start to come from that. It's going to take time and you have to nurture it. It's a lot like, I don't know, planting a tree. Like it's going to grow into something huge and awesome, but like you need to celebrate the steps along the way. Like when you see that sapling sprout from the ground, like you just need to pay attention to that. Or like going to the gym. If I go to the gym and I'm trying to lose weight or get more muscular and I don't kind of like take snapshots of my progress, I'll never know how far I came. So I think that's the biggest thing in retention is like, what's your repeat customer rate right now? What's your AOV? Like taking all these benchmarks and just starting to measure those week over week so you can start to see those small increases and that keeps you motivated to keep going.
That was just a brilliant analogy, I think. That was a fantastic episode, Alex. Thank you so much for getting on this episode and talking to us about very interesting nuggets about returns, about retention, about how e-commerce brands should focus on their long game, not their short-term gains. So it was fantastic. Thank you so much for being on the podcast with us today. Do you have any parting words?
Um, I think give customer retention a try and make sure you give it enough time to actually see the results. And there's a lot of, like I said, maybe 25% of people are focusing on retention right now. So if you're one of the people listening to this episode and you're saying, hey, this is something I want to get started with, you're putting yourself in front of the vast majority of ecom right now, and you're giving yourself a great head start. So the best time to start with customer retention is today. So find something and just get started.
That was great. This is amazing. Thank you, Alex. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye bye.